35 years ago, scientists released 140 sea otters into California's turbulent coastal waters, an effort many dismissed as a failure when almost all the otters vanished and the legendary kelp forests collapsed into rocky wastelands. But what most people missed was the invisible power these predators held, the ability to flip entire ecosystems on their heads. How did rescuing a handful of otters come to rewrite the rules of ocean recovery? And why did it take so long for anyone to notice? The answer begins centuries before the experiment ever started. Long before the arrival of European ships, the Pacific coast of North America thrived under the watch of a remarkable predator. From the icy waters of Alaska to the warm coves of Baja California, nearly 300,000 sea otters patrolled over 600 miles of shoreline. These animals, small but insatiable, carved out a balance that shaped entire underwater landscapes. Each otter could eat a quarter of its own body weight every day, often devouring as many as 25 sea urchins before the sun set. Their appetite was not a threat, but a form of stewardship. By keeping urchin numbers in check, otters protected the vast kelp forest that swayed just offshore. Towering strands of giant kelp rose over 100 feet from the seafloor, forming underwater canopies where more than 800 species found shelter and food. Rockfish, abalone, sea stars, and harbor seals all depended on the dense thickets of kelp. The forests buffered storms, stabilized the coastline, and stored carbon drawn from the air above. For the Chumash, Ohlone, and other coastal peoples, these forests offered abundance and meaning. Otters were woven into their ceremonies, stories, and diets. Elders recall a time when the relationship between otter, urchin, and kelp was understood not as science, but as lived experience, a cycle taught through generations. The people hunted otters with respect, never taking more than the sea could spare. Their stewardship ensured that the forests endured, and that the delicate balance remained unbroken. The secret to this harmony lay in the otter's place at the top of the food web. Without their constant grazing, sea urchins would swarm the reefs, stripping away the kelp and leaving behind only barren rock. But as long as otters patrolled the kelp beds, the forests flourished. This invisible force, one predator shaping the fate of an entire ecosystem, would come to be known as a keystone effect. The otter's presence was quiet but decisive, a single thread holding together the tapestry of life along the California coast. In these ancient forests, the rhythm of predator and prey set the pace of life. The kelp grew tall, the urchins kept their distance, and the otters, unaware of their own importance, maintained the balance. It was a world of abundance, watched over by a guardian few ever saw, but whose influence touched every corner of the underwater realm. That balance, so enduring, would soon face a test it had never known. By the dawn of the 20th century, the silence beneath California's waves spoke of disaster. The fur trade had left the coast nearly empty of sea otters. Just 50 survived near Big Sur by 1938. Without their watchful appetites, the kelp forest collapsed. Sea urchins, unchecked, multiplied 100-fold and began stripping the last stands of kelp. The underwater world that had once teemed with life was stripped to bare rock, transformed into what divers called urchin barrens. Scientists and fishermen alike stared at the devastation, desperate for a solution. The first attempts were basic, even hopeful. Teams of divers, wetsuits zipped, dropped into the cold water with hammers and mesh bags. For hours they pried purple urchins from the rocks, hauling them to the surface by the thousands. One veteran diver, his hands raw and cramped, described the work as bailing the ocean with a thimble. Every patch they cleared was overrun again within weeks. Even with years of effort, the urchin armies always returned, and the kelp did not. Chemical fixes were proposed. Poisons and pesticides were meant to target urchins and spare everything else. But the risks were too great. Toxins drifted with the currents, threatening abalone, fish, and the very kelp they aimed to save. The idea was shelved, leaving the barrens untouched. Restorationists tried planting young kelp by hand, anchoring seedlings to the reef in hopes of a comeback. But the urchins, still hungry, devoured the new growth almost as soon as it appeared. Less than 5% of these plantings survived. The cost soared above $50,000 per acre, yet the forest never returned. Each year the patches grew smaller, the budgets thinner, and the frustration deeper. Commercial urchin harvesters joined the fight, hoping to turn the pest into profit. But the urchins reproduced faster than they could be collected, and when the market crashed, divers left the water, leaving the barrens to spread unchecked. Meanwhile, nature withdrew its own helping hand. Sunflower sea stars, once a major urchin predator, were decimated by a mysterious wasting disease. Over 90% vanished, leaving the urchins free to multiply. By the 1980s, the pattern was undeniable. No matter how many urchins were smashed, harvested, or poisoned, the kelp did not return. The ecosystem resisted every bottom-up fix. In research meetings and on dive boats, a new consensus began to take hold. The problem was not the kelp, nor the urchins, but the absence of their ancient predator. The only way forward, some argued, was to bring the sea otter back. The moment had arrived to gamble on a top-down solution. In the summer of 1987, a convoy of trucks rolled out from the Central California coast, each carrying a controversial cargo, live sea otters, sedated and tagged for a journey west. The plan, drafted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and supported by a coalition of state and federal agencies, aimed to create a safety net for the southern sea otter. Oil spills loomed as an ever-present threat along the mainland, and San Nicolas Island, remote, windswept, and ringed by kelp, offered a possible refuge. The logistics were daunting. Otters had to be captured in the wild, assessed for health and age, then transported to the Monterey Bay Aquarium for holding and veterinary checks. Each animal received a radio transmitter, clipped to a rear flipper, so biologists could track their fate after release. Of the initial 124 otters captured, only 74 met the size and health criteria for the move. 4 died from stress in holding tanks, and 1 was returned to the coast. In the end, 69 otters, 16 males and 53 females, made the flight to San Nicolas Island that first year, forming the core of what would become an 89 otter cohort by the close of the early phase. On the island, Navy personnel and biologists worked side by side, assembling floating pens and preparing for the delicate task of reintroduction. The operation was as much political as biological. Fishermen from Santa Barbara and Ventura watched with apprehension, their livelihoods tied to the abalone and urchin beds that ringed the Channel Islands. In heated meetings and courtrooms, their representatives argued that otters would devastate shellfish stocks, threatening a fishery worth millions. The compromise, hammered out in Washington, drew a line across the ocean. South of Point Conception, an otter-free zone would be enforced. Any sea otter found outside the designated sanctuary faced removal, a policy written into federal law to appease the fishing industry. Inside the program, doubts simmered. One project manager, reviewing the daily logs, described the atmosphere as tense but determined. "We were walking a tightrope, every decision scrutinized, every loss magnified," he later recalled. The ethics of capture and transport weighed heavily on the team. Divers and veterinarians debated the risks of sedation, the stress of confinement, and the uncertainty of what awaited the otters in unfamiliar waters. Some believed that the telemetry tags would offer answers, tracking each animal's survival and movements. Others worried that the very act of intervention might do more harm than good. As the first crates were opened and the otters slipped into the kelp, the sense of hope was matched by anxiety. Would they settle and breed, or simply vanish into the open sea? The fate of the 89 otter cohort and the future of the island's ecosystem now rested on choices made far from shore. For the fishermen, the boundary south of Point Conception became a line in the sand, one they vowed to defend. For the scientists, each radio signal represented a fragile chance at recovery, and a test of whether human engineering could repair what centuries of exploitation had undone. The first weeks after release brought a reckoning few on the team had prepared for. Sea otters, loaded with radio tags and hope, slipped from their crates into the kelp beds around San Nicolas Island. But the ocean, indifferent to plans and policy, had its own terms. Within days, the radios began to fall silent. Some signals blinked out at sea, never to be heard again. Others traced impossible journeys, otters swimming more than 60 miles, drawn by a powerful urge to return home. The very instinct that had helped them survive centuries of hunting now pulled them away from the sanctuary meant to save them. The losses mounted quickly. By the end of the first year, nearly 80% of the original cohort was gone. Of the 69 otters released in 1987, only 13 to 15 remained on the island. The rest had vanished, some returning to the mainland, some entering the forbidden waters of the otter-free zone, others succumbing to the hazards of an unfamiliar coastline. A single statistic haunted the field logs. Around 40% of the otters died in that first year, claimed by stress, entanglement, or the jaws of predators. 4 had never even made it to open water, dying in the holding tanks at the Monterey Bay Aquarium before their journey could begin. For the field veterinarian, each loss was personal. She kept a notebook filled with numbers and names, but what lingered were the moments: an otter refusing food, another circling the pen in panic, one last heartbeat before silence. Years later, she would recall the regret that settled over the team. "We thought we were giving them a second chance," she wrote. "Instead, we delivered them to uncertainty." On the island's pier, a diver who had protested the project watched the boats return, sometimes empty, sometimes with a body wrapped in a tarp. He shook his head, convinced the operation had cost more lives than it saved. For the fishermen watching from shore, the experiment was proof that science could not simply impose order on the sea. The ethical weight of every decision pressed down on the team. Each radio signal lost was both a data point and a life. As the months passed, hope gave way to sober accounting. The engineered approach, so carefully designed, was unraveling in real time. The survivors clung to the kelp, a handful of outliers in a landscape that seemed unchanged. The dream of rapid recovery faded, replaced by the slow realization that nature's timetable could not be forced. The field season ended not with celebration, but with a question that would echo for decades. Had intervention brought restoration or only more loss? In the years that followed the return of sea otters to California's coast, the underwater world began to change in ways that few had dared to hope. A quiet renewal began. Kelp forests, once reduced to scattered strands clinging to barren rock, erupted back to life. In areas where otters hunted, kelp density soared, sometimes by as much as 100 times compared to stretches of coast still ruled by urchins. The difference was not subtle. Where otters thrived, the ocean floor transformed from wasteland to jungle. Giant kelp rose in thick canopies, their blades shading the water and creating shelter for a host of returning species. Rockfish, once rare, multiplied as the forest returned. Visible recovery followed. Surveys tracked a 5-fold increase in their numbers, with young fish finding protection among the kelp's tangled roots. Harbor seals began pupping in coves that had been empty for decades, drawn by the resurgence of food and cover. More than 100 species, some absent for generations, reappeared in the shadow of the growing forests. By 2024, the otter population along the mainland coast had climbed to nearly 3,000. Though this is still just a fraction of the original 300,000, the ecological rebound is unmistakable. A coastal ecologist studying the transformation called it a system flip. One predator, he said, had redrawn the map of life beneath the waves. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Where otters returned, so did the forests, and with them, the abundance that once defined California's coast. The central lesson was clear to those who watched the data unfold. In the long struggle to restore balance, nature's own mechanisms proved more powerful than any human intervention. For families who once made their living from the sea, the return of the otter was not celebratory. Along the Santa Barbara coast, generations of divers watched their abalone and urchin harvest dwindle to a fraction of what they once were. In some towns, landings fell by nearly 90%. A father and son, their hands still rough from years of diving, sold their boat after the last profitable season. The loss was not just economic, but personal. A way of life slipping away, replaced by uncertainty and resentment. At the Monterey Bay Aquarium, educators welcomed a different future. School children pressed their faces to the glass, watching rescued otter pups tumble through kelp fronds. The aquarium's director spoke of new opportunities. Tourism in Monterey Bay now brings in over $3 billion each year, with otters as the star attraction. Yet even here, the promise is not complete. Climate-driven marine heat waves, like the one in 2014, can strip kelp forests bare in a single season, threatening both wildlife and the businesses that depend on them. For indigenous youth, the revival of kelp forests carries a double meaning. Some see it as a chance to reconnect with ancestral stewardship, while others mourn the loss of access to abalone and urchin beds that once fed their families. Across the coast, the risks remain real. Great white sharks now account for over 40% of otter deaths, a reminder that every gain comes with new dangers. These unresolved tensions between recovery and loss, between old livelihoods and new economies, linger in every tide pool and harbor. The question of how or whether to intervene further remains open, shaped by forces both human and wild. Today, kelp forests only thrive where sea otters hold the line, proof that one predator can shape an entire coast. As climate change and pollution threaten even these fragile gains, every otter matters more than ever. Restoration is slow, setbacks inevitable, but the lesson endures. True recovery demands the patience of nature, not the impatience of humans.